that will never be considered a drop-in by StarMix?
So far, we have not changed that 250 RFU threshold, and so you can have a higher confidence that it is not from drop-in if it's above 250 RFU.
Understood. The next parameter on there is saturation, which you previously explained. Can you explain, and I'm particularly referring to pages 6 to 7, what was done with respect to saturation in that parameter?
So for saturation, some of the 99 single source profiles that were generated the peaks were very high, and so they were used in the saturation study, but also we purposely put in very high amounts of DNA into the amplification process to sort of get to that level. So we had 7 different samples that were amplified, not at our normal target DNA amount, but a much higher excessive amount. And
we're back on the record. This is State of New Jersey versus Paul Caneiro. We are continuing with the Daubert hearing under indictment 19-020283. Can I have the appearances of counsel for the record?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Assistant Prosecutor Nicole Wallace on behalf of the state.
Good afternoon, Judge Chris Decker, Assistant Monmouth County Prosecutor.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Mike Wicke on behalf of Paul Caneiro, who is seated to my left.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Christopher Godin on behalf of Mr. Caneiro, who is present in court to my left.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Victoria Howard, also on behalf of Mr. Caneiro.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Our witness is back on the stand. We're about to start cross-examination. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead.
If I could get just the demonstrative set up. I think I have to ask the clerk to project it, right?
Yeah.
Can I proceed, Your Honor?
You can.
Good afternoon. Can we agree that you're not a software engineer?
yes,
Your background is in forensic DNA analysis.
yes,
You were not involved in StarMix's development.
that's correct.
You've never seen the StarMix source code.
That's correct.
You're not aware then of how the source code actually implements the StarMix model.
That's correct.
You're also aware that when StarMix releases a new version, they will frequently change the model.
I don't know if I was aware of that, no.
So that they will actually, or so you were not aware that in between at least some versions of StarMix, they will actually change the scientific model that they use?
Are you referring to the source code?
No, I'm referring now to the model again. I apologize.
The model being,
The actual model that StarMix implements.
well, there are many changes with every new version, so I can't speak specifically to any one of those changes.
But you're aware, for example, that in the earlier versions of StarMix, degradation was modeled linearly. Now it's exponentially.
I would have to look at that information because I don't know at what version that would have changed.
Are you aware of how allele variance is modeled?
To some extent, yes.
Can you explain your understanding of that to me?
Allele variance, there's a few different, I think 2 or 3 different ways that you can model p-kite variances in general. And the only one I can recall off the top of my head is, I believe it stands for the longest continuous chain. I may be wrong about that. But I do know that there are at least 2 or 3 ways of looking at p-kite variances, and all of those are assessed, and the best one for each locus is established.
And just to be clear, I'm not talking about the stutter variances, I'm talking about the allele variances.
I think any variances would be under that.
You believe that they're both the same?
No, but I believe that they have different ways of looking at them and assessing them.
So you're not familiar with something called the Duncan-Taylor quantum effect?
No.
You've never heard of that?
I believe I've heard of it, but I couldn't speak to it.
You're aware also that burn-in process has changed over the course of the software?
Yes, I am aware to some extent.
You're familiar with something called Smart Start?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
And can we agree that even if the actual model itself does not change, it's possible that the way that the model gets implemented in the source code could change between versions, right?
I wouldn't be able to speak to that.
You wouldn't be aware of that.
Correct.
Like I said, because you're not involved in any of that, you're not here to offer an opinion on it.
That's correct.
Now, in addition to not being a software engineer, can we agree that you're not a theoretical Bayesian statistician?
Yes.
You're aware that StarMix uses a Metropolis Hastings sampling method?
It's involved in the procedure, yes.
You're aware, though, that that's not the only sampling algorithm that an MCMC algorithm can use, right?
That's the only one that I'm familiar with because that's the only one that StarMix uses.
So you're not familiar with, for example, the Hamiltonian Monte Carlo? As a result of that, you can't speak to the relative advantages or disadvantages of using one versus the other.
That's correct.
Would it be fair to say that prior to your exposure to StarMix, you did not have any experience with Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms?
That's correct.
You had never heard of the Gelman-Rubin diagnostic prior to StarMix?
That's correct.
You're aware that the Gelman-Rubin diagnostic is not the only way of measuring chain convergence?
Yes.
You don't know why that diagnostic was chosen over others, though?
No.
And do you know how the Gelman-Rubin diagnostic is calculated?
I don't believe I do, no.
Even a little bit? You're not familiar with it at all?
I'm familiar with it as much as I need to be able to review the data in a StarMix report and to evaluate and determine if I can use that data, but beyond that, no.
So then can you tell me the extent to which you are familiar with it, please?
Regarding the Gelman-Rubin,
How it works, how it's calculated, what the inputs are?
the information that I have about Gelman-Rubin is what I spoke to already, which is basically that when data is input into StarMix, that there will be these 8 chains or 8 starting points, if you will, where the software tries to determine these genotypes and then give them weights. And basically, it goes through a resampling process, which is what's been referred to as the MCMC, or Markov chain Monte Carlo resampling choice, I guess, if you will. And basically, the StarMix will go through, the software will go through a series of guesses, and guessing as to which genotypes make sense, which alleles might go with another allele, more than another allele going with a third allele. And so it will give weights after all these resampling events have occurred. And these 8 chains are resampling, basically, along the way, and once they converge or they come to an area of convergence, you would expect a Gelman-Rubin to be of a number that is 1.20 or less, and that indicates that these chains have converged close enough to each other that the StarMix has basically explained the DNA profile well. And if the number is higher than that, then you might want to reevaluate your number of contributors. You might want to look at your profile and see if there's any artifacts that you may have missed. But that is the extent of my knowledge regarding Gelman-Rubin.
So as a practical matter, you know that you want it to be as close to 1 as possible, and you certainly want it to be below 1.2, right?
1.20, yes.
But aside from that, you don't really understand what it represents or what it is or how it's calculated.
I don't have any knowledge of anything beyond what I've said.
Understood. I'd like to talk about validation. You spoke about this on direct a little bit. We can agree that there are differences between a developmental validation and an internal validation.
Yes,
This is a distinction that Swigdan makes as well, right?
yes.
And this doesn't just apply to StarMix, this applies to any software,
Any procedure, any instrument,
any method.
any method.
If Omega wants to sell a new amplification kit, they have to demonstrate its reliability with a developmental validation.
Yes,
And as you said on direct, the developmental validations are ordinarily much more comprehensive and broad than an internal validation.
yes, I would agree with that.
Fundamentally, in an internal validation, you're trying to simply show that you can get this set up properly in your laboratory.
Essentially, yes.
And when you go to do an internal validation study, you don't do that before the developmental validation study, right?
That's correct.
You only do an internal validation study if you believe that it's been shown to be reliable in the developmental validation study.
Correct.
Internal validation studies are important.
Yes,
They help you demonstrate that a lab can reliably apply a given method.
correct.
They also help you figure out the limitations of a given method.
That's correct as well.
For that reason, they also help you determine what the standard operating procedures are going to be for that method.
That's correct.
They're also a requirement, am I right?
Yes,
The FBI quality assurance standards require every CODIS certified laboratory to do that.
every accredited laboratory, yes.
Every CODIS, accredited laboratory. If you were to violate those standards, your lab could lose access to CODIS.
That's possible, yes.
You cannot yourself implement a method if you haven't conducted an internal validation study,
That's correct.
even if other labs have successfully conducted their own internal validation studies.
That's correct.
Every laboratory is different.
Yes,
You can't substitute one lab's internal validation study for another,
that's correct.
and you would never do that.
It's required of us to do so, internal validations in our laboratory.
But even if it wasn't required of you under the quality assurance standards, you would still not do that, right?
I believe it's a best practice.
I want to talk about a couple of the specific samples that you mentioned on your direct. You talked about an 80-to-1 mixture as being the most extreme in terms of mixture proportions, right?
Correct.
And that 80-to-1 mixture then had a minor contributor with 12 picograms.
Correct.
About how many copies of the human genome is 12 picograms?
One cell has, I believe, 7 picograms, so it's less than 2 cells.
How many 80-to-1 mixtures did your lab study in the internal validation study?
We tested 2. There was an 80-to-1 and then a 1-to-80.
So you only tested 2 mixtures that had an 80-to-1 or a 1-to-80 mixture ratio?
Yes,
So you only tested 2 mixtures that had a minor contributor with 12 picograms?
correct.
I want to touch on SWGDAM. Do you know how many SWGDAM members there are?
I believe it's approximately 50,
And there are most of them in the law enforcement community?
and academics as well.
The SWGDAM is an organization that was started by the FBI.
I believe so, but I'm not sure.
You're aware that the executive director of SWGDAM serves at the pleasure of the FBI laboratory director?
I believe that's correct.
I want to talk before moving on about the idea of a sample being suitable for analysis. I think you may have touched on this during your direct, but can you give me an explanation or your explanation of what the difference between a sample being suitable for analysis is versus not?
Well, in our laboratory, a DNA profile has to have results at least 5 of the 24 areas that we test for, 5 loci. And if it has less, that we call it too limited, and we will not draw conclusions on that sample.
Do you have statistics on the number of samples that your lab analyzes in a given year?
Not at hand, but I'm sure we have them.
They'd be available though?
I'm sure we could compile them.
And do you know what, presently at least, what percentage of your samples are marked as not suitable for analysis?
No, I don't have a number.
And so then you also wouldn't have a number for what percent of your samples were marked not suitable for analysis prior to StarMix either, right?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to say, though, that it would almost certainly be larger than now that you're using StarMix?
The type of statistic had nothing to do really with our ability to use a profile for comparison. We would look at the profile. I cannot recall what our threshold was of getting results prior to StarMix, or prior to using this kit called Global Filer, I should say, but it has really nothing to do with statistics, which is StarMix.
Maybe I wasn't clear. Would it be fair to say that now that you use StarMix, a smaller portion of the samples that your lab analyzes are marked as not suitable for comparison? You can analyze more samples now than you used to be able to prior to StarMix.
Well, that is true, but what you started to ask me was about samples that were too limited, meaning, again, if they had results at 5 loci or more. And so now the question is slightly different in that you're asking, I believe, if we can evaluate more samples with StarMix, and we can. We can evaluate 4 persons where we never could before, and more 3-person mixtures.
And you said earlier that you may be able to actually compile the data on that to see how much that has changed with the use of StarMix?
Again, you were asking me about samples that were too limited, and I had said yes, I believe we could compile that data. I think it would be very difficult to compile the data that you're now asking for, but I suppose it might be possible.
But you don't regularly track it yourself?
Correct.
Let's talk about the developmental, the SWIG-DAM internal validation guidelines. Could we please publish to the room? Specifically, I'm referring to States Exhibit S6. It's S6, right? Referring to S6, specifically I am at page 8. Can we agree that we are at the section of these guidelines talking about internal validation?
Yes.
Can we agree that the third sentence up there says that some DNA typing results may or may not be determined to be suitable for analysis?
I'm sorry, where are you referring?
Right there, the first sentence on the second paragraph. Depending on the features and capabilities of the probabilistic genotyping system, some DNA typing results may or may not be determined to be suitable for such an analysis.
Correct.
Can we agree that that's what we were just discussing a few minutes ago?
That would refer to the limited samples, the 2 limited.
The next sentence directs laboratories to identify data features that would render a profile appropriate or inappropriate for probabilistic genotype. Sorry, I need a yes over.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
The next sentence after that says that data should be selected to test the system's capabilities and identify its limitations.
Yes.
And those limitations, like we said, are how you create rules for determining whether a sample is suitable for an analysis or not.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of how many people were involved just within your laboratory in the StarMix internal validation study? The first one you did for 2.4?
That would be myself and my laboratory director.
Just the two of you?
Yes.
How many hours did you spend on that internal validation study?
I wouldn't be able to estimate how many hours. These were over months, and each one involved the running of samples, many samples.
And you personally, or the lab director personally ran those samples?
I personally ran those samples.
You didn't use any other lab techs?
Not for that, no.
Would it be fair to say that it was at least hundreds of hours of work that you did?
I really couldn't say. it's possible.
You spoke on direct about how there's really two phases to the internal validation study, the parameter study, right? That's the first phase?
Correct.
And then the sort of more what we think of as the internal validation study itself, right?
Correct.
When you're doing the parameter study, you want to make sure that you're using samples that are representative of the type of data that you see in casework, right?
Well, in that particular, in the setting of parameters, you're trying to show star mix all the different variations that a single source profile might look like.
But again, a single source profile encountered in casework.
Yes, but not from the wide variety of sample types that we obtain DNA results from.
So it's not important then for the parameter study to use the kinds of samples that you would expect to find in casework.
It's important to, for the parameter study to give as much information as possible. So those single source DNA profiles were basically from blood, blood stains or swabs from the inside of the mouth, which we do encounter in casework. But it was more important during the internal validation study portion to be able to have representative samples that you would see in casework, so mixtures of all different kinds and ratios.
That was in the internal validation study, the second phase.
Correct.
But just to be clear, for the first phase, it is your testimony that it's not important to use samples that are representative of the range of samples one would expect to find in casework.
As to the extent of how much DNA was present in those samples, yes. You would want to represent what you would see in casework, but not the type of sample.
So in terms of mixture proportions, things like that.
Even in the single source profiles, we looked at, like, for example, the saturation study that was part of the setting the parameters. That would be looking at samples that you might get in a particular case where the DNA is excessive. It should not be that high, but so it was representative of some samples that we get that could be saturated.
And we can agree that ESR was involved in your parameter study?
Yes,
One of the documents that you received when you purchased the StarMix license was an internal validation guide, right?
I don't recall that.
You don't recall that?
From ESR?
From ESR.
No, I don't recall that.
Was StarMix the first probabilistic genotyping system that your lab had tried to validate?
Yes,
So you had never calculated allele or stutter variances prior to using StarMix?
that's correct.
You'd never calculated locus-specific amplification efficiencies prior to using StarMix?
That's correct.
Now, when you, as you said on direct, you mixed the samples together, correct? For the internal validation study.
Correct.
You analyzed them,
Yes,
and then you sent those electropherograms to ESR.
that's correct.
And then they created the parameter study document that you saw on direct, right?
That's correct.
For the record, I am putting up. So for the record, I'm putting up S10. It should be the estimation of StarMix parameters. Is this the same document that you saw on direct, S10?
I believe so, yes.
And this is the document that contains all of your laboratory-specific StarMix parameters, right?
That's correct.
Are you aware of how ESR calculated those parameters?
I did not go through all the calculations with them, so no.
You testified on direct that I think that they use something called Model Maker.
Yes.
You're not familiar with how Model Maker works?
I've never used it myself, no.
Are you aware of whether or not Model Maker uses its own MC algorithm?
I'm not aware of that, no.
in either event, you just have the answers here from whatever that algorithm was, right?
The answers for the allele and stutter peak height variances and that locus-specific amplification efficiency, yes.
You did not technically review the conclusions in this document?
I did, yes,
Well, you read the document, right?
correct.
But you didn't conduct an independent technical review of what ESR did to get to the numbers in this document, did you?
No,
Like you just said, you don't know how they used Model Maker to calculate the parameters that your laboratory used.
not specifically, no.
I want to go to the first page right here. Can we agree that there's a disclaimer on the front page of this?
Yes,
Can we agree that that disclaimer says this document is a guide only? Can we agree that it says that?
yes,
Can we agree that the third sentence says, however, ESR makes no express or implied warranty regarding such information or data and hereby expressly disclaims all legal liability and responsibility to persons or entities that use or access this document and its content?
it does say that, yes.
Before we move on, I want to talk about your laboratory's drop-in parameters. You're familiar with drop-in being described as DNA raining from the ceiling,
I've never heard it
or
called.
snowing from the ceiling, I think, sorry.
No, I've never heard that.
It's unexplainable, or at least unexplained.
And non-reproducible,
That's right, it can't be replicated.
correct.
Would it be fair to call drop-in noise?
It could be noise.
In your parameter study, was drop-in modeling turned on?
Well, drop-in was one of the parameters that would be assessed, would be determined.
Well, do you know how the drop-in parameter was determined?
Yes.
Can you tell us?
So as I mentioned before, we did not see any drop-in in the samples that we gave to ESR to do the study. And so they looked at other laboratory drop-in rates. And these laboratories had they were using the same systems we were using. Same instrument, the same kit, the same what's called cycle number, which is how many times those billions of copies, how many cycles are needed to make those billions of copies. And it used a default drop-in rate, since we didn't see any, from all of those different laboratories that were similar to us. And that was 250 RFUs.
The record, I am turning down to the section of the parameter study discussing drop-in. We're at page 6 of 23. Are we looking at the same thing?
Again, we're on S10.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes,
Now, can we agree that it does say there that your laboratory observed an insufficient drop-in peaks within the 29 cycle profiles to inform a gamma prior distribution?
yes.
Can you tell me what the difference between, well, first before that, and can we agree that as a result, rather than using a gamma prior distribution, your laboratory used a uniform distribution?
Yes, that's what it says, yes.
Can you explain to me what the difference between a gamma distribution and a uniform distribution is?
No,
Can we agree that your laboratory still uses a uniform distribution for drop-in peaks?
yes,
Now, this particular document was made in 2017.
yes,
So in 2017, your laboratory did not have enough data on drop-in events to be able to model it with a gamma distribution, correct?
correct.
It's been 7 years since this document was created.
Yes,
Your laboratory still hasn't seen enough drop-in events to be able to model it with a gamma distribution?
yes, because you would need to be able to determine that an allele was drop-in.
Do you know what a uniform distribution is?
I'm not familiar with that term, no.
Like we said, after ESR calculated your laboratory parameters, you could move on to the second part of the validation study, right?
Correct.
And this is the part of your internal validation where you applied the SWIG-DAN guidelines explicitly?
Yes,
ESR was involved in this as well?
yes,
Much like with the parameter study, you made the mixtures and sent the electropherograms to ESR?
that's correct.
You did not have anyone within your laboratory conduct the deconvolutions themselves?
No.
That was StarMix that did that, or ESR?
For 2.4.6, that's correct.
Yes. And so all of the charts and graphs on your internal validation study document were created by StarMix,
Yes.
not by your laboratory?
By ESR.
Excuse me. All right, I'm going to move to S11. This is the internal validation of StarMix version 2.4 in your laboratory.
Yes.
Can we agree that the first page of this internal validation study document has the same disclaimer as the parameter study document?
Yes, it does.
I would like to talk about section D. Specifically, for the record, Your Honor, I am on page 11 of 50 of the internal validation study. We are looking at the sensitivity and specificity plots, right?
I believe so, yes.
Now, the y-axis there is the log of the likelihood ratio
Yes.
calculated for a given sample.
Yes.
The x-axis is RFU.
The x-axis is, that is, I believe that is the likelihood ratio. No, that's, I apologize. Yes, the RFUs, yes.
The average peak height
Peak
for a given
heights,
sample.
correct.
Where did that average peak height come from?
I'm not sure. I would think that it was from the samples that had been run, and Model Maker had accepted a range of average peak heights, or made a range of average peak heights. But I don't really know for sure.
So you're not sure how the average peak heights for these were calculated?
Well, these graphs are separated into the 2-person mixtures, 3-person mixtures, and so on. So it could be from those particular mixtures that the average peak heights were determined.
But did these numbers come from StarMix or somewhere else?
They were calculated by ESR.
How did ESR calculate it?
I obviously don't know specifically.
You don't know whether they used StarMix or not?
No, I don't know that.
You spoke on direct about a couple of samples from this study that had shoulder peaks.
I don't believe I did.
Were there not 2 false exclusions that were the result of shoulder peaks?
They were not from shoulder peaks. They were unresolved, 2 peaks that were unresolved because their sizes were so close to each other that the software only recognized one and not both.
And the software here being the Gene Mapper software?
That's correct.
You were able to look at these electropherograms and see what you're talking about, this 1 base pair resolution issue?
Yes.
You reviewed all of these electropherograms prior to sending them to ESR, right?
That's correct.
You didn't notice this when you sent them to ESR originally?
I don't recall if I noticed or not, but it would still be important to see how StarMix would evaluate something like that.
So you're not sure whether you noticed those before you sent them to StarMix or after StarMix sent you the results?
Yeah, I do not recall.
Before moving on, I want to talk about the Gelman-Rubin diagnostic just one more time. I know we said that that threshold of 1.20 is the threshold for whether or not the chains have converged.
That's correct.
So you're saying that if your Gelman-Rubin diagnostic is below 1.2, the chains have converged.
That is my understanding, yes.
And where did you get this information from? How did you learn it?
From ESR.
Do you recall what ESR said? They just gave you that number, 1.2?
That was information, I believe, that was in the internal validation studies summary that we're seeing here. I believe that number comes from that study.
So you believe that that number came from this internal validation study?
I should say it didn't come from this study, but it was presented in this study as one of the troubleshooting methods. Yes, I believe it's in this particular study summary.
And you don't know, though, why 1.2 is the threshold for convergence versus not?
That's correct.
I want to clarify something from your direct, because I don't fully understand it. You had spoke about I think you called it the performance check for 2.5.11, right?
Correct.
And you re-ran Model Maker on 2.5.11, right?
Yes.
I would like to show you the charts. Let me see. So I think we're at S12. Right? Can we agree that these two charts right here on page 2 have the allele and stutter variances?
Yes.
Now, you testified on direct that between version 2.4.06 and 2.5.11, the allele and stutter variances were the same.
We're basically the same. No significant difference.
I was going to say, we can agree that these are two different distributions that are on this chart, right?
They have slight differences, yes.
They have slight differences, which means they're not the same.
That's correct.
After you conducted this parameter study, you did this Model Maker study again, did you choose to go with the 2.5.11 parameters or the 2.4.6 parameters?
Because they were basically similar, or not significantly different, it was recommended to us that we keep the parameters from 2.4.6.
Who recommended it?
The person from ESR that we were working with.
Why did they recommend it?
Because in their minds it hadn't significantly changed.
But there are some small differences, right?
Some small differences, yes.
And you had already done the work to calculate these new distributions for 2.5.11, right?
That work was done by ESR.
But to be clear, you could have simply started using these new distributions with these new parameters, right?
If that had been recommended to us, we would have.
You also said on direct that the reason why you didn't do this initially was because you didn't know that you had to when you had a new version of StarMix that you were implementing?
That's correct.
ESR didn't tell you that you needed to do that?
I'm not sure that they told me or not, but I did not remember, and therefore we just went ahead with our performance check.
Are you aware of whether or not the model that StarMix is implementing is different between 2.4.06 and 2.5.11?
I don't think I recall knowing that.
You're not as sure one way or the other?
No, I don't recall that.
Now, like we said, one of the goals of an internal validation study is to establish a given method's limitations.
Yes.
In the case of probabilistic genotyping, we're talking about mixture complexity, right?
That is one of the possible limitations, yes.
Mixture complexity is a sort of catch-all term for how difficult it is to determine who the contributors to a mixture are.
Yes.
More complex mixtures are more difficult to analyze than less complex mixtures.
And more equal parts mixtures as well.
So for one example, if a mixture has more contributors, that can make the mixture more complex.
That's correct.
So if you have more contributors, it can make the mixture more difficult to analyze. Doesn't always have to, but it can.
It can cause a result where deconvolution can't occur. Basically, when you have more people in a mixture, you can have situations where it cannot pull out any individual DNA profile.
But generally, mixtures with more contributors are more complex than mixtures with less contributors.
I would agree with that, yes.
Degradation is something else that can cause a mixture to be more complex,
That's correct.
particularly if you have samples where one of your contributors is highly degraded and one of your contributors is less degraded.
That's correct.
Contributor ratios can also add to complexity.
I suppose.
Like you said earlier, if you have a bunch of contributors that are very similar in size, that can be a difficult mixture to analyze.
That's correct.
For the same reason, if you have one major contributor and then several small low-level contributors, those several small low-level contributors can also be difficult to distinguish between.
Right.
Another source of complexity is total template amount.
Yes, if you have very low levels, yes.
If you have low-level mixtures, it's more difficult to analyze.
It can be impossible to analyze.
Allele share is another example of complexity, right?
That's correct.
Allele sharing is when contributors to a mixture have the same alleles in a given locus.
Yes.
When contributors share alleles with each other, you have an increased risk of false inclusions.
Yes.
Can we agree that related individuals share a lot of alleles with each other?
Yes.
More than, at least, is average in the general population.
Yes.
That means that relatedness is another source of complexity.
Yes.
Samples that have a lot of related contributors are more complicated to analyze than samples that don't. All other things being equal.
I don't know if I would say that they're more complicated, but you would have to factor in the relatedness issue if there was a related individual.
Can we agree that related contributors can also cause an analyst to underestimate the number of contributors?
Yes.
You're also more likely to underestimate the number of contributors when you have a low template profile, right?
Yes.
You're also more likely to underestimate the number of contributors when you have a profile with a lot of degradation.
It's possible, yes.
And obviously, if you have a profile with related contributors, low template, and a lot of degradation, that's much more difficult to analyze. That's a much more complex mixture.
It can be, yes.
When we're talking about the kinds of mixtures that your lab can reliably analyze, can we agree that one of those mixtures, or one of those limitations, is the number of contributors?
Yes.
Your lab tested 3- and 4-person mixtures in its internal validation study.
And two-person mixtures, yes.
And 2-person mixtures. As a result, your analysts are not permitted to analyze 5- and 6-person mixtures.
That's correct.
You've established other limits as well.
Yes.
So for example, you found that when samples have a DNA concentration of less than 120 picograms per microliter, they have to be amplified again.
I believe it's lower than that number, but I cannot recall at this time.
Would it help if I were to provide you with a copy of your letter that you wrote to the court?
Yes, it would, thank you.
Your Honor, let the record reflect that I am approaching the witness with what has been marked as State's Exhibit S2. So can you tell us what that threshold is?
That if we have results at the quantitation step, it's the second step of the DNA analysis, that we will re-amplify if it is less than essentially 12 picograms per microliter.
12 picograms.
12 picograms per microliter.
I was off by a factor of 10. And this is done to assist with determining the number of contributors.
Yes.
Because below that threshold, you see more dropout.
Yes.
You also require 5 loci as the minimum for a DNA profile interpretation.
That's correct.
Is that 5 loci per contributor or just total?
Well, it would depend, but mainly it's just total.
So if you have an electropherogram that has at least one allele and at least 5 loci, then you can analyze it.
Yes, we would use it for comparison.
Will your lab report a statistic that has a minor contributor that's less than 2% of the overall mixture?
No,
You will not do that.
correct.
So if you have a minor contributor that has 2% or less of the overall mixture proportions, your lab will mark that as not suitable for comparison.
It's less than 2%, but yes, we will not use it for comparison.
And why was 2% chosen?
2% was chosen, which goes back to the 80-to-1 and 1-to-80 mixture ratios that we looked at, with that one part being 12 picograms, that was the lowest. And we also, for determining the percentage, we looked at the 80-to-1, the 1-to-80, 40-to-1, and the 1-to-40. And when those were run through StarMix, that minor contributor, that one part person, the one part contributor, was in the range of 2%, sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower. So our laboratory decided that 2% was the average ratio of that contributor, that we would not, that was, equal roughly to the 12 picograms that we didn't want to go under because we hadn't validated under. So that 2% is our cutoff, and if StarMix determines that a contributor is 2%, or sorry, less than 2%, then of the mixture, then we won't use it for comparison.
Now, can we agree that in casework, you don't know the actual mixture proportions?
Correct,
Because you don't know the ground truth.
that's true.
So you have to rely on the mixture proportions that are calculated by StarMix.
That's true, yes.
And when you conducted your internal validation study, did you, as a part of that study, do any analysis of whether the mixture proportions calculated by StarMix are accurate?
We did not do any additional studies, no.
Can you explain how the DNA quantitation step works?
The DNA quantitation step? So when we quantitate a sample, we add different reagents to the sample to sort of mimic the amplification process, which is the third step of the process. But instead of looking at the actual result from that amplification, during the quantitation step, we're trying to see how much DNA is present and how quickly the DNA that we have in a sample crosses a threshold. And that place where it crosses the threshold will be compared to a standard curve. So known amounts of DNA that have been amplified, gone through this quantitation step and are known to be certain amounts of DNA, we will generate a standard curve from that. And where our sample crosses this threshold, we will compare it to the standard curve, and we will extrapolate or determine from the standard curve points the quantitation of our sample. So we use a standard curve to compare our sample and then generate this estimated amount of DNA that's in our forensic sample.
Can you explain to me what is actually being measured in this process?
What's being measured is the amplification of one particular location of DNA that all humans have.
It's only one?
I believe it's only one, yes.
So it's not the STR loci that you were talking about earlier?
Correct.
This is a different part of the human genome than what gets measured in the third step.
That's correct.
But you're saying that every human being has exactly one of these.
Has this one location, yes.
So what you're saying then is that different people, if they give the same amount of DNA, or at least if your quantitation step measures the same amount of DNA, you should get the same output in terms of peak heights?
We can estimate from the amount of DNA in the sample what we expect to find in the DNA profile as far as peak heights. And that's why we have a cutoff, again, another threshold at the quantitation step, where if the sample doesn't have that much DNA, we won't even go forward and try it, because we know through for our internal validation studies that we're not going to obtain a DNA profile that we can use.
Now, your lab also noted that, like you said on direct, for LRs of less than 3,000, you see an increase in false inclusions.
For likelihood ratios that are below 3,000.
The phrase that your lab uses, at least in its disclaimer, is adventitious match.
Yes.
Whose phrase is that?
It's a common phrase in forensic DNA analysis. I don't know who coined it, though.
You're not sure where it came from?
No, it's very common.
You also say that as the mixture's average peak height, or at least as the component's average peak height drops below 300 RFU, StarMix's ability to distinguish between true and false contributors is diminished?
Yes. Yes.
You spoke a little bit on direct about the random match probability. And you said that one of the issues with the random match probability was that it was limited.
Yes.
Can you explain what you meant by that again?
Well, in our laboratory, we could only use it on single source profiles, or we also had something called a modified random match probability that we used on two-person profiles, that we could not distinguish one contributor's DNA profile from the other. We could put it into the equation and be able to get a statistic. So if the sample was a three-person and it was indistinguishable, we could not use that result for comparison because we didn't have a statistic for it. We could only use random match if we could draw out or separate out a major contributor's DNA profile from a three-person mixture.
That's correct. You would have an interpreted single source profile at that point.
Correct.
You would look at the mixture and you would effectively manually deconvolute it.
Correct. We had calculations in place that would help us do that.
But then you could use the random match probability for a mixture, at least certain kinds of mixtures.
Certain kinds of mixtures, yes.
Are you aware of whether or not StarMix can be used to calculate a random match probability?
I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware that the New Jersey State Police Lab uses StarMix to calculate a random match probability?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware of laboratories using the 99% genotype weight as a threshold for calculating a random match probability?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Can we agree, though, that that is a threshold that CODIS uses?
I'm not aware of that, no.
You're not aware of that? You also said on direct that in situations where you have multiple LRs that get calculated, the most conservative LR is reported?
Yes,
And the most conservative LR is the smallest one?
is the lower one, yes.
When you say lower, do you mean lower in magnitude, like closer to 1, or just always lower? Like if it's an exclusionary LR,
If it's an exclusionary LR, it will be the one that's closest to 1,
the one that's closest to 1.
yes.
And you consider that to be the most conservative?
I believe that is accepted, yes.
Before we finish here, I want to clarify just a couple more things. Can we agree that you're not here to offer a specific opinion on any of the evidence samples that were analyzed in this case?
That's correct.
You did not review the New Jersey State Police Lab analysis?
That's correct.
The New Jersey State Police analysis was conducted with StarMix version 2.8? You're unaware of that?
I'm unaware of that, yes.
You're also not here to offer an opinion on the Bodie evidence either?
That's correct.
You haven't technically reviewed any of the samples in this case?
That's correct.
You haven't reviewed any of the StarMix deconvolution or LR reports?
That's correct.
You're just here to testify about your laboratory?
Yes.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Ganem, on cross-examination, drop-in was discussed with you. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, drop-in is essentially contamination, isn't that right?
That's a possibility. It might also be elevated noise. We do try to separate that out by the analytical threshold. It could be another contributor as well that we're only detecting very minimally.
And you indicated that you had not seen a lot of drop-in at your lab with your tests, is that correct?
Well, it's very hard to assess if we've seen it or not because the samples that we're looking at, we don't know the answer to. We do know the answer for proficiency test samples after we've done the test, and so we can only evaluate those, and we haven't seen any drop-in in those samples.
There was some talk about allele sharing, do you recall that on cross?
Yes,
Now, allele sharing, whether it's fortuitous or it's due to relatedness, that's not a star mix issue, is that right?
that's correct.
Right, it's essentially the nature of genetics itself, is that correct?
That's correct.
And analysts have had to deal with that prior to star mix, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, who determines whether a sample is suitable for comparison with regard to, or suitable for star mix with regard to running that through star mix?
In my laboratory, we only run samples through StarMix if we have visually not been able to exclude an individual as being a contributor to a mixture.
But it's the analyst that makes that determination, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And I know this has been discussed, but you don't necessarily know the weight in terms of nanograms or picograms of a minor, for example, in a mixture until the data is run through StarMix, is that right?
Well, we don't even know it at that point. We only know the percentage of that contributor in the mixture via StarMix.
And same with ratio proportions, would that be correct also?
Yes.
It was discussed that the purpose of the internal validation is to test samples that would normally be represented in casework. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And that's accurate, right?
Yes.
Okay. Are you able to validate for every single possible scenario?
No,
And why is that?
because every sample every forensic sample is unique to itself. We try to encompass all the possible variables of ratios, mixture ratios, different amounts of template input DNA, but we can never test every single situation and scenario.
Now, is a low likelihood ratio that supports inclusion of a non-contributor, is that an error or mistake of the software?
No,
Is it essentially the result is dependent on what you would be looking at in the mixture, is that right?
yes, if you have a partial DNA profile, you have not complete results. That can be a situation where you're including more individuals. If you have a four-person mixture where you have a lot of information, that also allows for a lot of different genotype combinations to be considered by StarMix, and that could also possibly falsely include someone.
There was some discussion both on direct and on cross of the likelihood ratio and the way it was reported out. In other words, the most conservative statistic reported out, is that right?
Yes,
And when you say the most conservative statistic, is that in favor of the person of interest whose reference sample you're comparing it to?
yes, that would be considered conservative.
I may have one moment, Judge. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Brief recross, Your Honor?
Sure.
Can we agree that your internal validation study did not look at related contributors?
That's correct.
You spoke on redirect about the visual exclusion prior to running a sample through StarMix.
That's correct.
What is your laboratory's policy on whether a sample can be visually excluded or not?
If there is evidence at not each of the loci, but at a majority of the loci that a person would be excluded given the number of contributors that we've already determined, then there's no need to put the profile through StarMix.
You need then to have a majority of the loci show that that person could not have been a contributor?
Yes, or it can be even a few loci, or possibly even one, depending on how many, the number of contributors in the mixture.
So you would possibly exclude somebody from a mixture on the basis of one locus prior to putting it into star mix?
It's possible, it's possible.
And I apologize, this is something I didn't ask you earlier. Do you have a sense of how much money your laboratory spent purchasing the star mix licenses?
I'm not involved in the purchasing.
So you don't know how much money the Union County Prosecutor's Office spent to purchase star mix,
No, I don't.
to validate it,
No, I don't.
to train your analysts to use it?
I believe the training that ESR provides, I want to say it was in the range of $3,000 per person, but I believe that's the case.
But you're not generally aware of all of the money that was spent on star mix?
That's correct.
Nothing further.
Prosecutor, anything else?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
All right, you may step down. Thank you. You can call your next witness.
Thank you, Judge. The state calls Kristen Naughton. Judge, if I may step out to grab her?
Sure.
She's in the hallway.
Thank you, by the way.
Just watch your step. If you don't mind, as you come over, we could just take that exhibit away.
Oh, yes.
And if you don't mind putting your left hand on the Bible, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Okay. Once you get seated and comfortable, can you state your full name for the record and spell your last name, please?
So my name is Kristen Naughton. Last name is spelled Naughton.
Thank you. Prosecutor, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Ms. Naughton.
Hi.
What do you do for a living?
I am the Director of Validation and Quality Control at Bodie Technology.
So are you essentially a research or validation scientist?
Yes, validation scientist.
Okay, and you said you're employed at Bodie Technology?
Yes.
Where is that located?
Lorton, Virginia.
And what is that Bodie Technology, essentially?
It's a private DNA testing laboratory.
When did you begin employment at Bodie?
August 2003.
Now, what are your responsibilities as the Director of Validation and Quality Control?
So I oversee two departments. The validation department performs all of our validation work at our company prior to casework operations using that technology in real casework. And then the quality control group does testing on reagents that come in our door before we use them. So if we determine a reagent is a critical reagent part of the process, that group performs quality control testing on every new lot we receive prior to it being used.
As the Director of Validation, do you have a team of scientists or validation scientists?
Yes.
Okay, can you explain that and how that works and what it's comprised of?
Sure. So that team is responsible. They get delegated various validation projects. Our team looks at new technology or published literature to determine if there's something that our lab should be performing to help improve the types of cases that we could, the DNA results in the types of cases. So that could be anything from a DNA extraction method to, in this case, would be like a software validation.
Can you tell the court a little bit about Bodie Lab in general and the different departments?
Yeah, so the majority of our laboratory performs the casework DNA testing, and then we have support and research groups that function primarily kind of outside of that operational group. So like I said, the validation group kind of falls within one of those research groups where we look at that new technology and determine what might be applicable that we want to use in casework. Another research group develops like different types of products that might help crime scene collection and things like that.
So essentially you have the research or validation scientists, and then you have the DNA analysts who process and analyze DNA.
Correct, and my group works really closely with the technical leader, which oversees the casework operations group for what we decide to validate.
I'd like to go over your educational and professional background as it relates to your profession. I'm showing counsel what's been marked as S16.
It's just a CD.
I'm handing you a copy.
Thank you. 16, you said?
S16, Judge, yes. Ms. Naughton, I'm showing you what's been marked as S16. Do you recognize that?
Yeah, so this is my CV.
Okay. It's essentially your curriculum vitae, is that right?
Correct.
Is that, was that document created by you?
Yes.
And does that reflect your education and your training and experience?
Yes.
Okay, can you summarize your education for us?
So I have a bachelor's degree from North Carolina State University. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry, a Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry with a minor focus in genetics.
Now, you indicated that you're a validation or a research scientist. Are you considered also a DNA analyst?
So technically in our company, the DNA analyst role is defined very specifically by the FBI quality assurance standards. And those are analysts that have gone through training and authorization to perform DNA analysis on casework. So I don't fall quite under that title, but we perform all the same laboratory procedures, perform the same DNA analysis that a DNA analyst would perform. And in fact, the new technology that we validate, we then train the DNA analyst to use.
Now, in your educational background, well, let me ask you this. Do you know whether there are certain courses that a DNA analyst is required to take in their educational training and background?
Correct, that's defined in the FBI quality assurance standards that they need to take: biochemistry, molecular biology, genetics, and statistics.
Did you take those courses?
I do have those courses.
Approximately how many DNA samples have you processed and analyzed over the course of your career?
Thousands.
I want to move on to your professional experience prior to Bodie. So from the time you graduated college, it looks like in 1999, is that right?
Correct.
And then you began at Bodie on what date?
August 2003.
Prior to that, between college and when you began at Bodie, what did you do? Where did you work?
So I had a couple different positions in the research field still about DNA testing, but it wasn't necessarily focused on forensics. So some agriculture, some plant biology, and one company that was like doing medical diagnostic testing.
Okay. That brings us to 2003 when you started at Bodie, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. When you initially began your employment at Bodie, what were you hired as? What was your title and your responsibilities?
At that time, it's called research scientist. It would be the equivalent of the validation scientist title today.
And what were your responsibilities as a research scientist?
So when I started, I was performing the laboratory work for validations. I was analyzing the data. I was writing up the validation summaries. And I was under the direction of my supervisor.
Did you do that from August of 2003 to November of 2013?
Yes.
And approximately how many validations did you perform during that time?
I would probably say average of 10 per year, so of some sort. There's various types of validations, whether it's developmental validation, internal validation, validation modifications. So probably by this point in my career, I've performed hundreds of validations.
What types of things were you validating?
Again, it varies wildly from we could get a new piece of plastic in the lab that we need to test, or a new DNA extraction, quantification method, amplification method, detection method, software.
And what were your specific responsibilities as a research scientist when you were doing these validations? Like, what specific work did you perform?
So that was performing all the laboratory techniques in the lab, creating the mock samples that we would need or the control samples that we would use during our validation, Again, analyzing the data, interpreting the results from that, and writing up a validation summary.
Okay, now, you were a research scientist doing validations until approximately, it looks like December of 2013, is that right?
That's when my title changed, but I'm still doing validations today.
Okay, so you're currently still doing validations?
Correct.
And your title changed in December of 2013
Correct.
to what?
So 2013 would have changed to validation services manager. So in this role, and even prior to this, not only could I perform internal validations at Bodie, but we also provide validation services at other agencies. So a local or state laboratory could hire us to come in and help with their validation process at their lab. And so we would come in and perform the laboratory work there. We'd, again, analyze their data following their SOPs, write up the validation summary, and provide training back to that lab.
So other labs would essentially sometimes outsource their internal validations to you?
Correct.
Approximately how many validations did you conduct or did you oversee during that period between December of 2013 and September of 2016?
So I was performing even external validations as early as 2003 as well, with an average of about 2 contracts per year, so maybe a dozen or so.
Now, in October of 2016, your curriculum vitae indicates that you became the Director of Validation, Training, and Quality Control, is that right?
Correct.
Was that considered a promotion?
Yes.
Okay. And what were your responsibilities as the director? And you touched on it before a little bit, but as the Director of Validation and then Training and Quality Control?
Yeah, so this had an extra department than I talked about previously, where it was our training department, and our training department oversees the continual growth of our employees through that progression of casework analyst. So at Bodie, we start at working in the lab, and then you progress all the way through analysis. And that time period of training could take anywhere from a year to 2 years to get through the entire process. So we had another department with staff of trainers that would provide that continual career growth training.
And then that, in January, it looks like, of 2022, what, if anything, changed with respect to your title?
The training department got their own director at that time, so that they could focus on, again, the career growth, and I could focus on the validation side.
So in total, over the course of your career, approximately how many forensic DNA validations did you perform and or oversee?
Of course, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I'm sorry, sure. If you can estimate, approximately how many validations did you perform and or oversee in the course of your career?
Oh, the career, hundreds, yes.
Now, is there any mandatory continuing education for a validation or research scientist?
No, only technically the DNA analyst role applies to follow the quality assurance standards.
Is there anything that you do to continue your education nonetheless?
Yeah, I still attend conferences when I can. I do a lot of journal article readings, especially when it comes to a new technology. We do a lot of webinar-based learning or specific training on that new technology prior to us even developing a validation plan for testing.
Are you a member of any professional memberships?
Currently, I'm currently a member of the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors.
What is that?
It's a professional organization for forensic laboratory management.
Now, I'm looking at your CV where it says presentations given, and there are numerous ones on here. Are you able to summarize those? Is there a common thread, or are they on different topics?
They're on a lot of different topics, but they all center around validations that I've either performed or reviewed or worked with my colleagues on.
And I see under special projects indicated Baltimore County 2022 Star Mix validations. Do you see that?
Yes.
What is that?
So that particular one was not about necessarily validating the software for that laboratory, but we went in and performed the laboratory work, meaning that we created the control samples that they then used in their validation.
Now, if you know, how long has Bodie been conducting DNA analysis?
So we were founded in 1995, and they've been doing DNA testing since then.
Is the lab accredited?
Yes.
By what organizations?
It's currently accredited by ANSI National Accreditation Board. And we are accredited to the ISO 17025 2017 standards, as well as the FBI quality assurance standards. And we follow that agency's supplemental forensic requirements as well.
I'm showing council what's been marked as S17 and S18.
Thank you.
I'm showing you what's been marked as S17 and then S18. Now, looking at S17, is that one page?
Yes.
Okay, and then S18 is 2 pages, is that right?
Sorry. Yes.
Okay, and what is S17?
So this is our certificate of accreditation that was issued by the ANSI National Accreditation Board, showing that we passed their audit requirements and accreditation requirements.
Okay, and is there an expiration date on that at the bottom?
Apologies.
Specifically.
Oh, I see it, yes, April 30th, 2025.
And what is S18?
So this is this specific scope that they accredited us to, so all the different parameters of our testing that have fallen under our accreditation.
Your Honor, at this time, the state seeks to move S16, S17, and S18 to evidence.
No objection.
So moved.
Can you write that down for me? Now, in addition to being accredited to the 2 standards that you just indicated, the quality assurance standards and the ISO standards, does Bodie follow any guidelines?
So the SWGDAM, our scientific working group for DNA analysis methods, they have more specifications or guidelines and clarifications that stem from the FBI quality assurance standards that we also follow.
Okay. And does the lab also have its own standard operating procedures?
Yes.
And who's responsible for creating those?
The technical leader is responsible for issuing those or approving the final versions of those. My team does help support, develop those, or edit those as needed.
With regard to ensuring that the standards that we discussed and the SWGDAM guidelines are met, is your lab audited?
Yes.
Can you explain that audit process?
Yeah, so every year there is some sort of assessment done on the laboratory, whether it's an internal audit, clients visiting, different areas. It could be a remote audit of our stuff, and then every 4 years is a larger assessment where auditors would come into our laboratory, watch what's going on in the laboratory, as well as review all the documentation between the previous audit.
Okay. And now, with regard specifically to your role in validations, what kinds of safeguards or standard operating procedures are used to ensure the integrity of results and the limitation of contamination and things like that?
So we follow all the same standard operating procedures that a DNA analyst would in casework, especially for a technology that is already implemented and online. So a couple of examples could be that during extraction, we run a reagent blank, and that will show that the reagents and the process was free from contamination. During amplification, we run a positive and negative control. Again, the positive control showing that the amplification product worked as expected.
With respect to validations, is there any level of review, such as peer review or a technical review?
Yes, so the validations undergo several layers of review. Usually one of our senior validation scientists does a peer review first, and then I would provide a second review and review technical content and the data. The next review would be our technical leader, that she accepts the technical information that's been presented and that it meets the quality assurance standards and other standards that we follow. And then it's also pushed to several other lab director management in our company, including the laboratory director, a senior scientist, the director of applied research, and our quality assurance manager.
Now, does Bodie use probabilistic genotyping software?
Yes,
What's the name of the software that it uses?
StarMix or SDRMix.
And what version?
We are currently using 2.5.11.
Are you in the process of getting another version?
Yeah, the version 2.9 is in the process of being validated, but we have not, that hasn't gone through final technical review or implementation for our casework to use yet.
Now, do you have a role in that validation that's currently taking place?
Yes, I assigned the project so far to a validation scientist to perform, and I reviewed the testing plan and authorized what the testing plan should be for that.
Okay, and why did the lab choose to upgrade from 2.5.11 to this current version?
There's several new features that, again, can help enhance the different feature, or the different tools that we, there are new features in the software that will help us more than what we're currently using, as well as one of the main features of moving to this software that we didn't get to in between is there's a large efficiency gain on the computer hardware side of that it takes less time to run per sample.
Now, did the lab begin using StarMix in casework in 2018?
Yes.
Okay, did you have a say or a role in deciding whether ultimately to purchase StarMix?
I was involved in conversations about the options for different probabilistic genotyping software, but ultimately, because we are an outsourced lab, the decision to go with StarMix was mainly client-driven, that a lot of our clients were implementing that software.
Did you also do your own research on StarMix and the developmental validations prior to the lab purchasing it?
Yes.
Okay. And were you satisfied with those?
Yes, it had a fully published developmental validation at the time and a standardized curriculum course that you could take to learn how to use the software.
Did StarMix version 2.5.11 undergo an internal validation at your lab?
Yes.
And what was your involvement with that?
So I reviewed the validation after it was complete along with our technical leader. And together with the technical leader, we were able to develop the standard operating procedures and train subsequent DNA analysts.
Upon your review of that validation, did you find that it complied with the SWGDM guidelines for probabilistic genotyping?
Yes.
What was the time frame of that internal validation?
So we started it in 2017, and it took about a year to get all the data through analysis and the summary written up before we were able to train.
And then you went live in 2018 with that?
Correct.
In other words, you used it in casework in 2018?
I believe, yeah, at the end of 2018 would have been the first DNA analyst signed off.
Can you describe your StarMix training?
So before the validation, the director of applied research and myself went to an ESR training, which is the manufacturer of the software. It was 4 days long. It was located in Topeka, Kansas, at a laboratory there that was hosting the training.
Once StarMix was validated, who was responsible for training the DNA analysts at Bodie?
The technical leader and myself took that lead role.
Did they also undergo the StarMix training that you had through ESR?
Yes, we currently still send all of our DNA analysts that are learning StarMix to the ESR training first before they enter our internal training program.
Now, does Bodie perform DNA analysis and validations for agencies in other states as well?
Yes.
Once the internal validation of StarMix was completed and prior to going live with it, did any outside forensic science commission or organizations have to sign off on it?
So all of our clients would have had to review our validation and accept that our standard operating procedures would meet the requirements for the data that they would accept back to their lab. We also, in particular, I would think of the New York State Department of Health reviews every validation before any case can be processed with that technology in New York. So no matter which local agency in New York, the state agency has to review and approve that validation. Most of the other states, it's down to the lab itself that has outsourced to us approving it, so it could be local, state.
In what percentage of cases does Bodie use StarMix for?
We are probably about 50% right now on clients who would prefer us to use StarMix over manual interpretation.
Are there certain standard operating procedures that are used as guidance to determine when you're going to use StarMix versus manual interpretation?
Sure, so the primary decision is if that client can review and accept our data. So the client guidelines would, if their lab is not online with StarMix yet, then we perform manual interpretation. And then secondary to that, we can review each mixture itself and determine if it's eligible or suitable for StarMix. And then after it's run through StarMix, we can also still decide to perform manual interpretation as well.
So certainly you would have to make the decision prior to running something through StarMix as to whether it was suitable for StarMix based upon your validation guidelines.
Suitable and also client approved to use.
Okay. And we'll get to the suitability shortly. Approximately how many StarMix runs and analysis have you conducted in the course of your career?
So using the actual software myself, I've run a couple dozen samples through myself, but I've reviewed probably hundreds of analyses from StarMix.
Judge, at this time, the state would move to qualify the witness as an expert in the field of forensic DNA analysis and forensic DNA validations.
No objection.
She will be qualified as an expert. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. What, if any, involvement did ESR have with your internal validation?
So we did not hire them to perform our internal validation, but per our scope of service technical support, they were there to help advise us if we wanted to ask them questions or came across something that we didn't fully understand. We were asking them questions along the way to help evaluate our data.
And did they assist you with those questions?
Yes.
Because it was their software that they created, right?
Right.
Now, are there essentially two parts to an internal validation process?
For StarMix, there is. There's the first part where you almost calibrate the software to learn what your data looks like, and then we perform the internal validation. That's very unique to the StarMix software.
Why is it important for StarMix to learn what the output of your instrumentation looks like? Why is that important for StarMix to know that and to have that?
So StarMix does rely on biological models, and so it needs to know what peak heights and what peak variance is expected from data specifically processed in our laboratory from our extraction procedures run on our genetic analyzers.
Is that essentially because StarMix weighs those things and factors that into its probability determinations?
Yes. And it uses those to also help determine how well an evidence sample lines up to what you observed in your validation.
You're referring to the diagnostics?
Yes.
With that? Okay. After the two parts to your internal validation process were completed, were any documents prepared summarizing them?
Yeah, there's two separate summary documents.
And can you just explain what those are briefly?
Yeah, so there's the summary of that estimation of parameters, first step of the calibration of the software. And then the second summary is the internal validation.
Now, those document summaries, do they include every single test that was done and all of the underlying data?
So it includes a summary of all the tests that were performed, but there is a massive amount of underlying data that's included in other raw data binders that I think probably total over 50,000 pages of data.
Okay. And do you know whether in this particular case that underlying data was made available to the state and the defense?
I believe it was.
And we talked a little bit just now about the purpose of the setting of the parameters. Can you describe your lab instruments?
So we run 3,500 genetic analyzers. It's a capillary electrophoresis instrument. The particular version that we have can run 24 samples at a time per injection.
The court has already heard testimony with regard to the DNA basics and the four-step laboratory process, so I'm not going to necessarily ask you about that right now, but in a nutshell, I want to talk about the parameters. When you're running the tests to calibrate these parameters, what kinds of samples are you using?
So these would have been lab extracted samples that were used to create known template amounts to run through the laboratory process. So we would have extracted the DNA in our laboratory, quantified the amount of DNA that were in those samples, created the template amounts that we needed to calibrate or test the software, provide the software the information that we were looking for. In this particular validation, we used the globofilar amplification chemistry. and then run on the 3500 genetic analyzer. And then we analyze the data with GMAP or IDX software prior to it going into StarMix.
And those samples that you used, were they all single source or single donor samples for that?
For the estimation of parameters part, yes.
Where did they come from?
Their lab staff donated buccal swabs.
Now, once the parameters were determined, what was done with those parameter values?
So those were then entered into or imported into StarMix as the settings that would be used to analyze the rest of the validation samples.
Okay, is there something in StarMix called Model Maker?
Yes,
Okay, and are you familiar with that?
yes.
Okay, what is that?
So Model Maker is a tool within StarMix that once you import your data, it looks at the peak variance, the peak height, it looks at each testing location that's within that chemistry and helps define what like a pristine sample would look like so that it has that biological model to compare back to.
And is Model Maker essentially the place in the software where these parameter values were entered into?
Model Maker, the final result of Model Maker generates some of those values that are then imported into the settings.
You mentioned that a summary of the estimation of parameters was provided after that testing was done. Do you recall that?
Correct.
Okay. I'm showing council what's been marked as S19. Judge, you can confirm that copy. Ms. Norton, I'm showing you S19. Do you recognize that?
Yes, this is our summary of the first part of that validation process.
All right, and is this document 33 pages approximately?
Yes.
Like here, 33? Okay. Who prepared this document?
So our validation scientist assigned to this project would have prepared it in conjunction with our director of applied research.
Is there a date on here that reflects when it was prepared?
The final draft version, or the final version that was approved is September 2018.
Looking at page 1, do you see where it lists numbers 1 through 8
Yes.
at the bottom? What are those?
So those are the different studies that went into setting the parameters that StarMix would need.
Can you let us, or tell us what those are, 1 through 8?
So sure, so the first one is analytical threshold, the second is looking at stutter ratios, the third is a size regression, 4 is allelic drop-in modeling, 5 is signal saturation, 6 is allele and stutter peak height variance, 7 is locus-specific amplification efficiency, and 8 is allele frequencies and theta values.
You indicated that the single source samples for this came from known donors. How many single source donors or samples were there for this study, the setting up parameters?
I believe there's 132.
How much template was targeted per amplification result?
It depends on the study that you're talking about. For stutter ratios, 1 nanogram, which is our optimal amount for global filer, was targeted. And then for, let's see, some of the samples that went into Model Maker, which would be to evaluate number 6 and 7 and number 5, those would be a variety of template amounts all the way starting at 2 nanograms down to 25 picograms.
When you're talking about template, what is that? What are you referring to?
The amount of DNA that went into an amplification reaction.
How is that measured?
So during the process of DNA testing after extraction, we have a quantification method that can estimate how much human DNA is in our sample. And then from that, we can extrapolate and do calculations for how much we are putting into the final amplification reaction.
The court has heard testimony previously about something called RFU.
Yes.
What, if any, interaction or overlap does that have with template?
So the template amount of nanograms, as that goes up, your RFU, or relative fluorescence units value off of the genetic analyzer, should also increase.
And is the RFU correlated to the peak heights on an electropharogram?
Correct.
Now, of these 132 single source samples, did you create something called sensitivity samples?
Yes, that would be the dilutions from these samples that went down from 2 nanograms down to 25 picograms.
Okay, now those were used for the second part of the validation, is that right?
Oh, they were used in this part as well.
As well, okay, but also for the second part of the validation?
Correct.
Okay. What was the purpose of creating these sensitivity samples, and what are they?
So as part of Model Maker, you need to teach the software to look at a variety of peak heights. So you want to see from saturated or very high RFU signal down to very little genetic information or low RFU.
How was that done?
In the lab?
Yes.
Okay. So in the lab, again, based on that quantification estimate that we have from our assay there, we can then calculate and do a serial dilution with pipetting and diluting out the product, and then adding certain amount of that into our amplification reaction, and we can control how much estimated amount of, in terms of nanograms or picograms, the amount of DNA that went into that amplification reaction.
I want to ask you whether a contamination assessment was done, but I first want to ask you, what is contamination?
So contamination is the introduction of exogenous DNA into a sample, so something that may not have originated from, in casework, like the evidence sample itself, but maybe originated from the lab or the processing.
What is the purpose of a contamination assessment?
That's to determine that you can, in this particular case, it's to determine that you can see contamination of allelic drop-in is more of the contamination that the software is looking in. So when it's not true contamination of a sample, but it could be a single peak, we call that allelic drop-in, and we want to make sure that StarMix or the software is not weighting that single peak overly confident as a true allele.
So drop-in can be a source of contamination.
In a way, yes.
And was a contamination assessment done in this validation?
Yes,
And that's what was later used to model allelic drop-in?
correct.
Can you explain how that contamination assessment was done?
Sure, so we evaluated separate than the validation control studies that we performed. We looked at actual casework. We looked at 500 reagent blanks and negative controls that were run through real casework samples. And those are controls that should have no DNA in it. So we looked at how often did we see peaks that were in those controls, again, knowing that they should not have any DNA.
How often was that?
It's less than 1%, and of that time, it was usually only a single peak up to 250 RFU that was observed.
Okay, I'd like to turn to each of the 8 lab-specific parameters and go over those with you.
Sure.
Specifically, I'm looking at page 3. The first one is analytical threshold. What is that?
So analytical threshold is the setting at which we can define that a signal coming off of the 3500 is a true allelic peak and not background noise.
What is the purpose of having an analytical threshold in the forensic DNA lab?
To be confident in that the signal that you are detecting is, again, truly allelic versus noise of the system.
Now, was analytical threshold determined here as part of this validation, or was it determined at some other time?
Yeah, that would have been determined as part of our global filer amplification chemistry validation.
And what was that analytical threshold determined to be in your lab?
125 RFU.
And again, you explained RFU, that correlates to the peak heights.
Yes.
So if there's a peak that's seen below the analytical threshold, what would be done with that?
Nothing in terms of what StarMix can see, nothing in terms of what could be contributed to a true allelic peak above analytical threshold. We do lower our peak detection threshold for looking at negatives, so we do look lower in that baseline to see if there's any contamination. So we do have the ability to kind of look below that analytical threshold visually to determine if there's other low-level genetic information there that is not above the analytical threshold.
The next parameter on page 3 is stutter ratios. What, if anything, did you do to determine that parameter?
So that was the bulk of this, the 132 samples. We went through, amplified those targeting 1 nanogram, which again is the optimal amount for this chemistry that we used. And then we looked allele by allele at what the stutter or artifact byproduct is of that process and what ratio that is to the true allele.
Are there different types of stutter?
Yes. So
Can you
there's,
define those?
yeah, sure. There's back stutter and -1 repeat stutter. There's forward stutter. Some testing locations have half stutter.
What's the most common type?
N-1 repeat.
And can you explain what that is?
Sure, so short tandem repeats, or STRs, are multiple fragment lengths of the same repeated sequence, and the biological process of doing that with the enzyme that's in that amplification process to make those copies sometimes creates that byproduct where it'll have one repeat less showing up, and it's at a very defined, well-modeled percentage compared to the true allelic peak.
How does star mix change the interpretation of stutter, if any?
So in GMAP or IDX, we set a binary stutter filter, and it's well above what we have observed in validation to make sure we're not calling a stutter peak allelic. StarMix has a little bit more sophisticated biological modeling that allows not just a set stutter filter at each testing location, but it's looking fragment size by fragment size to determine what is the most best explanation of that ratio to the true allelic peak.
Are there something called stutter filters at the lab?
Yeah, so the stutter filter is applied in that GMAP or IDX software, and again, that's set at validation of that chemistry, where we set it at kind of an artificially high threshold that we're going to make sure that we're not calling a stutter peak a true allelic peak.
When an electropharogram gets run through StarMix for deconvolution, what, if anything, happens to those stutter filters, or what does the analyst do with those stutter filters?
Yeah, so the initial interpretation is made with those stutter filters on so that they can determine number of contributors and how much approximate RFU they're expecting per contributor. And then they have to reanalyze that sample with those stutter filters turned off, because StarMix uses that data in their biological modeling to help determine true allelic peaks.
Essentially, would it be fair to say that StarMix takes stutter into consideration because it has the ability to statistically weigh and account for stutter?
Yes.
And with manual interpretation, was that a different case? Was that not?
It's a very binary decision, I think, because the stutter filter is set, so if it's filtered out, it can't be considered allelic. If it's in stutter position, our manual interpretation SOP still has some analyst discretion if it's just barely above for them to call it indistinguishable from stutter.
So what, if anything, did the lab do with regard to setting the parameters for stutter in this particular study?
So that was evaluating, again, all 132 of those donors, locus by locus, fragment length by fragment length, and determining what ratios we were seeing in that known data for true allelic peak height compared to the stutter ratio generated during the laboratory process.
The next, number 3, the next parameter is size regression on page 6. What is that size regression?
So size regression in StarMix is going to model if there is a decrease in peak height as the testing locations get larger in size. So if you have a degraded DNA sample, you'll tend to have larger RFU or electropharogram peaks kind of on that left-hand side of the electropharogram, and then they'll get much shorter or even drop out on the right-hand side as the fragment lengths get longer. So this size regression file that came from ESR is that mathematical algorithm that'll help predict how much RFU decrease you're going to see as you increase your fragment length of your sample.
Okay, and what was the value of that parameter, or what was done with it after testing?
So that particular file had no testing, it was just imported in from ESR. Again, it's their algorithm that they use to explain or help later in the StarMix reports. We'll see that degradation value and how that's calculated.
Okay, you mentioned degradation. What is degradation and what causes it?
So degradation is when intact DNA has been fragmented, so there may be a lot of shorter fragments that our current or amplification technology may not be able to detect larger fragments. If it's fragmented enough that you can't detect out past 300 or 400 base pairs, you may only see a partial profile. It can be caused by UV exposure, heat, moisture.
The next parameter on here, number 4, is allelic drop-in, and you did discuss drop-in, or we discussed it briefly.
Correct.
What was done to test this parameter?
So this parameter was defined by, that was us looking at those 500 casework reagent blanks and negative controls and data mining when we would call something contamination versus when we would call it allelic drop-in. If it could not be sourced from any other sample, it got designated as allelic drop-in. And yeah, those are characterized here. Again, less than 1% of the time was the value that we saw across our casework operations when it was observed, and the majority of the time was only a single peak observed, less than 250 RFU.
And is that essentially what your drop-in cap is, 250 RFU?
Correct.
What does that mean?
That's the setting where in Star Mix, if it's above 250 RFU, it's going to consider it a true allelic peak and not just a drop-in peak.
The next parameter, and I'm looking at page 7 now, is signal saturation. What is that, and what was done to get the value for that parameter or test that?
So that was part of our sensitivity study where we went up above where our optimal DNA template amount is. And on the genetic analyzer, it uses a camera to detect fluorescence. So you can think of it kind of when you take a picture. If you take a picture pointed at the sun, you get some oversaturation of that camera where the sunlight is really bright. So that can happen in a genetic analyzer as well. If there's a lot of fluorescent signal, it's going to oversaturate the camera detection, and as well as the software that analyzes that detection. So there's a cap on our 3500s that we really only see up to about 30,000 RFU, and then the signal is kind of plateau after that. That doesn't necessarily mean there's not more DNA in there, but the signal saturation from the genetic analyzer is there.
Okay, and what was the maximum, or what was the parameter that was set for that, for saturation? And again, I'm looking at page 7.
Yeah, so we saw alleles up to 30,000 RFU, but I believe we set it at 25,000 RFU where we started to see that plateau. 25,000 RFU is where we also started to see a huge increase in the number of artifacts that would occur when the camera is saturated, where it would be hard to interpret the profile.
Okay, so what would the lab do, for example, if it has a peak that is over that cap, that 25,000?
Yeah, sure. So we have a process in our laboratory that if the signal is saturated on our 3500, we can dilute that amplification product and then reload it on the genetic analyzer, and that would decrease the signal that the camera is seeing.
The next parameter, and this is specifically pages 8 through 11, allele and stutter peak height variance. What is that?
So that is going to be the information that when we put the sensitivity studies into Model Maker, the allele and peak height variance is going to be modeled by the software using that Model Maker tool that we talked about. And then it's going to provide a distribution curve of where most of the samples fall within.
Why is that important to model that?
It's good to know when you're running unknown samples how that falls against your modeling, because the software does use biological modeling, so you want to know when the evidence sample maybe does not look like what you had used during the validation.
And what specifically was done to model that and to test this particular parameter?
So this was 110 single-source samples, again diluted from 2 nanograms all the way in a serial dilution at several templates across, all the way down to 25 picograms. That was run across, we have 5 genetic analyzers, so we were looking at if there's any signal differences between the 5 genetic analyzers that would cause us to need to potentially model each genetic analyzer as its own model.
When you do this testing, do you use all 5 of your genetic analyzers?
And in this particular validation, we did, yes.
Okay. The next parameter is pages 8 through 11. It's the locus-specific amplification efficiency. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so in GlobalFiler, there are 24 different testing locations that are amplified at the same time in the same reaction. So balancing all of those testing locations to generate approximately the same quality of product at each testing location was done by the manufacturer of the chemistry. And then this would study inherently, there's always going to be like maybe one testing or a couple testing locations that perform a little less than some of the other ones. So this provides the software with what is an expected profile difference across. So you may have like lower peak heights at, testing site number 1 versus higher at testing site number 4, and that's normal and how a normal sample would look.
When you say testing sites, you're talking about loci?
Loci, yeah.
Specific loci, so there could be trends that maybe an allele at this loci might be higher or
Correct.
lower.
Yeah.
The next, I believe it's the last, number 8 of the parameters is the allele frequencies and theta values on page 11.
Yeah, so again, this is not data that we generated at the lab, but this is just documented what allele frequencies we use. And we use the publication from NIST.
Can you explain what allele frequencies are and how they're used, why they're important?
Yeah, so that drives the statistical weight of the profile observed. There's an independent study, a population study for each of the US populations that would document how often each allele at that testing location or loci is observed in a population and determine the frequency. So that helps determine the weight of observing a specific profile compared to the weight of observing another random unrelated profile in the US population.
Turning to page 11, I'm looking at specifically test 19, pages 31 to 33, appendix 8.
Yes.
What specifically are we looking at here?
So those are the final settings after the whole estimation of parameters or calibration of the software was done. Those are the final settings that were applied in the software to be used throughout the remainder of the validation.
Now, once these parameters were set and optimized, did you move forward with part 2 of the validation?
Yes.
Okay, and were these parameters input into StarMix to the software?
Yeah, part of this validation would have been documenting and finalizing those settings, and those settings would not have been changed.
Okay, now, all of this information that is in this particular summary document, the charts and the tables, et cetera, would they be required to be read by the DNA analysts who perform the casework prior, as part of their training session?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see if I have it. Thank you. Turning to the validation portion of the internal validation, what is the purpose of that? Why is it conducted?
So that's to make sure that we can internally show that the formulas that are applied and the mixtures that are going to be interpreted within that software are based on known genotypes and known results are performing accurately.
Okay, and per the SWGDM guidelines, is it essential that the lab conduct testing on the types of samples that would be seen in casework?
Yeah, that's one of the requirements.
Okay, and is it possible to test every single scenario that you would see in casework?
No.
What samples were used for this portion of the validation?
So it varies. We did continue with some single source testing, and we also then did 2 to 4 person mixtures.
And when you say mixtures, is that something that the lab created
Great.
from known donors?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and where did those donors come from?
Again, it's the lab staff that donated so that we could extract the DNA at our laboratory. And then we made those mixtures based on, again, the known quantity of those samples diluted to specific ratios that we would mix in a tube and then amplify that.
And again, that's important so that you could test StarMix and you would know whether StarMix is essentially getting it right because you know the ground truth of those mixtures. Is
Correct.
that right?
Yes.
Okay. Was all of the lab work, the 4-step lab processing of those samples to get a DNA profile, the electropherogram, was that all done at Bodie?
Yes.
And who was that done by?
Our validation scientist.
Was there any documentation, I think you mentioned it before, but was there any documentation with regard to this portion of the testing?
You mean the validation summary?
Itself,
Yeah,
yes.
the validation summary itself, yes.
And again, that's just a summary of the validation?
Correct. There's separate validation binders that contain all the DNA, all the laboratory worksheets, all the calculations that were done in the lab to create those samples.
I'm showing council what's been marked as S-147. And for the copy.
Thank you.
Ms. Norton, I'm showing you what's been marked as S-147. Do you recognize that?
Yes, this is our internal validation summary.
And is there a date on here that reflects when this was finalized?
October 2018.
And is this 44 pages long?
Yes.
All right, and the way this is set up is it's outlined essentially sections A through M that outline all of the testing that was done, is that right?
Yes.
All right, and then on pages 31 and 32, there are conclusions for each section, is that right?
Yes.
Now, did you, I should ask you, who created this document?
So this would have been the same validation scientist and the director of applied research worked jointly on this prior to myself and the technical leader reviewing it.
Okay, and did you review this as part of your duties and responsibilities with this validation?
Yeah, and the review process is interactive where we would have comments back and they would provide feedback and corrections and update clarifications within it.
And are the DNA analysts required to read this document as well prior to their, as part of their training?
Yes.
I want to turn to page 3 of S-147. Specifically, there's a table there that says Table 1, Overview of Samples Tested for Validation of Star Mix. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then there's A through M reflected.
Yes.
A through M, is that essentially the different testing that was done?
Yeah, each of those would have a specific reason for that section and the testing performed and across the whole validation would satisfy all of the FBI QAS requirements and the SWIG-DAM recommendations.
And what is the other material that's reflected in this particular chart? What is it showing?
So each section will have how many samples were used for that particular study, whether it was single source or a mixed sample, provides sample details about number of contributors, template amount that was amplified. And then it also is kind of specific to what was the point of us doing that study, where it would give us why are we performing this.
So if we could turn to section A, where it says accuracy of star mix interpretation and mathematical calculations. That begins on page 7.
Okay.
Can you explain what section A is and what was tested and why it was important?
Yeah, so this is essentially another sensitivity study. So the sensitivity study in biological modeling was used to determine how profiles would look. So this is now looking at that and as you run these samples through StarMix to actually interpret the DNA profile, is it interpreting compared to what we expect the profile to be, and also what's the likelihood ratio that's calculated at the end compared to the known reference. So as you see less and less genetic information from a DNA profile, your likelihood ratio should decrease in strength.
And that's essentially how the likelihood ratio in StarMix is supposed to work, is that
Correct. Yes.
Now, these particular samples that were used, the data that was used here, was this all single samples?
Single source, yes.
Single source samples, okay. And it indicates 11 samples were used from a dilution series, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Can you explain what specifically was done with regard to these samples and the specific testing?
So sure, so in the lab prior to amplification, they would have gone through, after quantification that we knew how much DNA was in that extract, it would have gone through a serial dilution to dilute out how much amplification product we then added to the amplification reaction. So those concentrations, again, range from 2 nanogram down to 25 picograms. And yeah, as we looked at that through the genetic analyzer, we saw that majority of them could produce full profiles, and then as you get down in less than 100 picograms, you start to see potential of allelic dropout.
Looking at page 7, figure 1, where it says plot of log LR versus input DNA template RFU, do you see that?
Yes.
And what is that plot and figure reflecting?
So that's plotting the likelihood ratio. The log is basically, if you look at those numbers, 29 means 29 zeros essentially at the end of that statistical value. So approximately 700 RFU, you see all the same value, although that actual number could have varied a little bit within the STAR mix report, but very minimally and comparatively to the strength of the profile. And then you start to see a decrease, and a rather sharp decrease as you start having less template RFU. So in STAR mix, template amount is measured in peak heights, whereas in the laboratory, we measure how much template goes into a reaction in amount of DNA, so nanograms. But again, those two should correlate very well.
And what, if any, conclusions were drawn with respect to this testing?
So this was when we compared statistical calculations of the likelihood ratio to manually calculating using Excel. We got the same exact value, showing that the software was accurately calculating the likelihood ratio. And then we also wanted to and did observe that as you have less genetic information, you have a lower likelihood ratio.
Okay, so you, just so I'm clear on this, you were able to manually calculate a likelihood ratio for a particular sample here.
Correct.
And compare that to the likelihood ratio that was given by STAR mix.
Correct.
And how did that fare?
It was pretty identical, minus potentially some like rounding and Excel differences, minor differences.
So did it show that essentially STAR mix was accurately calculating the weight of the evidence?
Correct.
Turning to page 10, section B. The effect of peak heights on interpretation. Can you explain what that is and what this study, the purpose of this study was?
Yeah, so this goes back to that camera saturation potential limit on the genetic analyzer. So when the signal of a true allelic peak is so tall that the camera is saturated, that peak may not be the true relative fluorescent units versus the camera limit of that. So then sometimes the stutter ratio is thrown off because the stutter peak is much smaller, usually less than 10% of that true peak. So that stutter peak would still be the true fluorescence unit for that peak, but you wouldn't get the expected modeling, basically, or diagnostic on your stutter ratio to that true allelic peak.
I'd like you to turn, if you could, to page 11, specifically figures 4A and 4B.
Yes.
What are we looking at here?
So that is two of the diagnostics that are in every STAR mix report, looking at the allele variance and the stutter variance. The mountain that you see in the graph that is a distribution curve of where most of your data should fall. So if you start to see that your diagnostic value is towards the tail, like in the top graph 4A, you see that that dot of how it interpreted the data is way off to the right of the graph. That is a result of that stutter and the signal saturation on the 3500.
Now, the court has heard about primary diagnostics and secondary diagnostics. Which diagnostic would this be part of?
This would be secondary.
And what was the conclusion of the outcome of this testing?
That these diagnostic tools are helpful in identifying potentially that the profile is not falling within the modeled parameters.
Turning to page 12, section C, where it says intuitiveness of weights with mixtures. I believe that's pages 12 to 13. Can you explain what the purpose of this testing was?
So this is further evaluation of simple two-person mixtures, again, checking the intuitiveness of the result of.
When you say intuitiveness, I'm sorry to stop you, what do you mean by that?
So every time, even before you run STAR mix, we can visually see the electropherogram or the data in GMAP or IDX, and the DNA analyst is trained to determine how many contributors, what approximate ratio am I expecting, what approximate peak heights am I expecting from each contributor. So they're going to have that base knowledge before we even run STAR mix to compare to. So you want to make sure that the STAR mix results are in line with what your visual interpretation of the profile is.
So essentially, with this particular study, you created a mix of two donors, is that right?
Yes.
And did you play around with like the mixture proportions?
Yes.
Okay, and what specifically was the outcome of that?
So when the, going section by section, when the mixture is 8-to-1, visually you're going to have a very major contributor on your data, and you should be able to deconvolute or separate out which alleles belong to contributor 1 versus contributor 2. We're also looking at mixture ratios in star mix, how close those estimates were to what we knew we put into the reaction. So an 8-to-1 would be an expected contribution of 89% and 11%, and star mix estimated 88% and 12%, so very close to the ground truth that we knew. And then the last column on table 6 talks about how much of the genotype per contributor could it actually pull out. So again, when you have an 8-to-1 ratio, it's fairly easy to assign the genotype to each contributor. So that's kind of reflecting that from the major you could get 100% complete disease profile, from the minor 31% complete.
And then when you get down to a 1-to-1 ratio mixture, what happens there?
Yeah, so the 50-50 mixture, star mix estimated 60-40, which again we consider fairly close to the expected ground truth. And then we expect that it should not be able to pull a profile. And I think this pulled one allele or something that probably was shared between the two donors.
Why is it more difficult to deconvolute a mixture when proportions get closer together, for example, like a 1-to-1?
Sure. So if the peak heights are all the same from both contributors, it's impossible without any other background knowledge to know which allele belongs to which contributor. So part of the continuous, fully continuous probabilistic genotyping is to utilize peak heights to inform potentially being able to determine which peaks came from one contributor versus another.
All right, we're going to take a break. We've been at this for well over 2 hours. I'll give everybody a 10-minute break and we'll start right back up.
Standing with the skills, We're sweating. Oh, you said it, but you don't look it. Don't worry, you look great. Feel sweaty. I know.
I'm just gonna step out and use the bathroom.
Oh, I thought you meant here, in the courtroom. Yeah, forget.
That's hilarious. That's really funny.
Pretty much, yeah. As of now.
It takes time.
There's no sign, judges or anything.
So you need like a. It's a lot, right? A lot.
Exactly.
Bob. Yeah.
So, like this is made, so this is RG15. This is made for investigation.
I can't. How you doing?
How about yourself?
Great.
Thank you for the decision.
Yeah, no problem.
She was,
No, and I'll follow up with the thing you asked me about.
no, it's not,
Yes, I understand.
not because,
No, I think,
not because it's what I want.
of course not, but I appreciate that you're like thinking about that and you want to do what's right for you guys.
Yeah,
So we'll do what we can to help you.
appreciate it.
And then with the other things that we've talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay. Yeah. And then I have to do is copy the ballistics. That's what I'm saying. But I think it's just getting those. I think they're gonna be more control. Yeah.
Kristen, are you good?
Yeah. 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 I think there's on. Yeah. Oh wait, no. Yeah, tell me where. Got it. I don't know if it's that, but I didn't move it out. So hopefully that will make things
I
go.
would have made me nervous that somebody else was leaving.
No.
All right,
Got nowhere to go. Just right here.
thank you.
No problem.
No. You sure? Yeah. You know what?
It's hard to sit in those chairs. They're not that comfortable.
No, they're not.
I don't know how you're sitting.
I'm new.
Great chairs. Right? And every time I move, it's like, everyone hears it.
What specifically was tested here and what data was used?
So this is the range of number of contributor samples that we tested, so ranging from 2 to 4, so including 2-person, 3-person, and 4 contributor mixtures, as well as a range of template amount, specifically looking at that lowest contributor amount made in the mixture.
Were you also, now you're testing sensitivity, were you also testing specificity here?
Yeah, so this is also looking at in the mixture when you potentially would include a random individual instead of the known individual, as well as possibly when the known individual does not have enough genetic information and could fall to the exclusionary support side of the likelihood ratio.
Is it essentially fair to say that in terms of sensitivity, is that the ability of the software to reliably determine the DNA profile of a known donor?
Yes.
Okay. And then on the other hand, with specificity, is that essentially the ability of the software to exclude a non-donor?
Yes.
All right. So can you explain your testing here and what those conclusions were?
So in total, there was 101 mixtures that went through this particular section of the study. Again, these were lab-created mixtures at known ratios that we knew the known donors to the mixtures. So those were run through StarMix for interpretation and then run through the statistical portion of StarMix to calculate the likelihood ratio.
Okay, and this was essentially 2, 3, and 4-person donors, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and I guess I should ask, with respect to the outcome of this validation, is there a limit on the number of contributors that Bodie has found in the validation for the suitability of StarMix?
Yes, if we believe the number of contributors is greater than 4 contributors to the mixture, it is not suitable for StarMix.
So essentially, what was the outcome of this testing? Can you summarize that?
Yes, so as average peak height from each contributor increased, you had a better ability to distinguish between true donors and non-donors to the mixture. And as you have less and less genetic information represented by the RFU amount of allele on that electropherogram, then the weight of the likelihood ratio tended towards 1.
And is that essentially how likelihood ratios are supposed to work and how StarMix is supposed to
Correct.
work?
A likelihood ratio of 1 is uninformative, meaning that it's equally likely that a random match could explain, or a random profile could explain the evidence versus the reference profile.
Okay. And then as you get higher than 1, that would support inclusion?
Correct.
And anything less than 1 would support exclusion?
Correct.
And does Bodie follow the SWGDM guidelines with respect to the verbal chart and equivalence for likelihood ratios?
Yes, so that was after the validation. SWGDM came out with guidelines that were defined the range that they wanted all U.S. testimony to follow for verbal scale of representing what the likelihood ratio meant.
Does Bodie have an uninformative range or an inconclusive range based on the validation?
An LR of exactly 1 is uninformative.
Okay. And then essentially Bodie would go by the SWGDM guidelines with respect to the verbal equivalent of that when testifying in court, is that right?
Correct. The SWGDM guidelines recommend not having an inconclusive range, but reporting the LR as it is with the verbal scale equivalency of how much support that is.
I'd ask you to turn to page 14 here where it says figure series 6. Do you see that?
Yes.
And there's 6A, B, and C.
Yes.
What does this reflect?
So these are the likelihood ratios from those 101 interpretations for the known donor. So the red dots would represent the true known donors to the mixture, and the blue dots are 500 randomly simulated profiles that were searched and compared to the profile.
Okay. And based upon your testing here and your review of the validation, how did StarMix fare with respect to this testing?
It performed as expected, meaning that, again, as less and less genetic information was available, the chance of an adventitious match to another genetic profile was increased. There's a summary in our appendix of the exact values when a known donor to the mixture fell below 1 or support for exclusion, and then the same for the random generated DNA profiles for when they went above 1.
Okay. Are you talking about false inclusions and false exclusions, essentially?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The false inclusions and false exclusions, is that you indicate that's documented in this summary?
Yes, it's in appendix.
Is that appendix 4?
Yes.
And is that on pages 41 to 42?
Yes.
We could turn to those pages for a moment.
Sure.
I'd like to ask you some questions. What was the highest likelihood ratio here supporting inclusion of a non-donor in each category?
So the highest in the 2-person. Sorry, can you repeat your?
I'm sorry, what was the highest likelihood ratio here supporting inclusion of a non-donor for each of the categories, like a 2-person, 3-person, 4-person mixture?
Okay, so sure, that would be the false positives per se, and the highest in a 2-person is a likelihood ratio of 2.0 6982. In the three-person,
Let me just stop you for a second. What would the verbal equivalent of that be?
I don't have that table in front of me, but I think it's limited support.
Oh, I can actually show that.
Sure.
I'm sorry, Judge, if I may just have one moment.
Sure.
Do you have the evidence? It's not. I'll come back to that question.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, I'm sorry, so you indicated the highest likelihood ratio supporting inclusion of a non-donor, specifically for a two-person mixture, and that was a 2.6 something?
Yes, that's the log likelihood ratio, yes.
Okay, and then how about the three-person mixtures?
So the log likelihood ratio is 1.6326 for three-person,
And what about a four-person mixture?
2.1592.
Now, in this particular section, section D, what was the lowest percentage of a minor contributor to a mixture that is seen in this study, or in this summary?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one?
Sure. And essentially, I can refer you to pages 36 and 37, appendix 2, and I'll ask the question again. So in this particular section, section D, what is the lowest percentage of a minor contributor to a mixture that was calculated here?
It's approximately 5%. I believe the 20-to-1 actually comes out to 4.7%.
Okay, and so what was the if you know, the lowest amount of DNA of a minor contributor in this particular section in terms of weight, picograms?
So the theoretical calculated based on the quantification estimate of our assay is 25 picograms.
Okay. And you testified earlier that these validation summaries are just that, they're summaries. Were any samples tested in this particular section, so section D, that are not reflected in the summary, where the minor contributor to a mixture was lower than 5% and or lower than 25 picograms?
So in this section D, while the theoretical value was intended to be 5%, StarMix estimated it at 3% of the mixture.
Okay. How about any other sections? Were there other sections of testing done where the minor was less than 5% of the mixture and or less than 25 picograms?
Sure, so there's another section coming up later in the validation that we'll talk about, which is our mock evidence samples. So these are samples that we did not intentionally create known mixture ratios versus take mock evidence item and run that through the laboratory and process that.
And did you also do something called N+1 testing?
Yes, so another section in here looks at if you were to estimate the number of contributors incorrectly, what's the impact of estimating one contributor higher and one contributor lower than the true value?
Okay, now aside from the N+1 testing, were you asked to summarize the three samples, so section D and the samples in section L, were you asked to summarize those and put them in a letter, and specifically the samples where the minor was below 5% and or 25 picograms?
Yes.
I'm showing council what's been marked as S20. Andy, where'd a copy of S20?
Thank you.
Ms. Naughton, I'm showing you S20. What is that? Sorry.
So this is a memo I wrote after looking again at that data package that we've provided that has the 50,000 pages. There's more information in that than what was summarized. The samples themselves are summarized in this, but we were able to look more specifically at different pieces of those reports. And this summarizes 3 of those samples.
Okay, let's talk about the first sample on page 1 of your letter.
Yes.
That's summarized. And that looks like a 1.
Objection, Your Honor, may we approach?
Sure. On our conference that we had early September, I was informed that they would have approximately a month to be able to take a look at it. The fact that they did or they didn't, that is up to them and where we were, but we were all over the case and allow this information to be testified to. But your objections noted for the record. Of course you can.
I very specifically said that since September, I never said that they represented the month. I promised that it's trying to
Well, and also if you go back in the record from months prior to that, we were also indicating at that point through the summer, that every month we thought that you were going to be done by the end of that particular month with the analysis, and it was just never done. So it's nobody's fault. I don't blame you in any regard. But I'm not going to lose the state from being able to testify as to this information, considering it goes to whether ultimately, in this court's mind, whether it's reliable or not. You know, the weight of the evidence obviously will be different if you would get to that point of the trial. You can make your arguments at that point, but as of right now, we'll allow it in. So your objection is noted for the record.
This court has this is court actual findings. This court has the way it's holding us right now. Sharing data points is fundamentally unfair. It's only supposed to those cherry pick data points, but again, either voting or the offer a proper
Ms. Naughton, I'm going to ask you if you can look at page 1 of the letter, and that letter was something that was provided by you, is that correct?
Yes.
And is that dated April 26, 2024?
Yes.
And is that 2 pages?
Yes.
Okay. On page 1, do you see down here where you have summary of contributors?
Yes.
What essentially is this information that you're including in this letter here?
So this is a screenshot from the STR mixed deconvolution report for this particular sample that was in section D. of our validation study.
And where does this come from? Does it come from a summary, the underlying data, or something else?
So it's the underlying data, it's the report that StarMix generates at the end of its run for how it interpreted the mixture. This portion has nothing to do with a likelihood ratio calculation at this point. It's just about the interpretation of the DNA profile.
So essentially, in section D, is this a 4-person mixture?
Yes,
And is the mixture ratio here a 10 to 5 to 2 to 1?
correct.
What is the lowest donor estimated to be in terms of percent?
It's around 5% based on the theoretical mixture ratio.
Okay. Now, I'm looking at where you have, you see where you have template RFU?
In that summary of contributor screenshot?
Mhm.
Yes,
Okay. And you have 1, 2, 3, and 4 as the contributors?
correct.
Which is the most minor contributor, 1, 2, 3, or 4?
Contributor 4,
Okay. And what does the mixture proportion say under contributor 4?
3%.
It's 3%, okay. And then underneath that is the degradation statistic, is that right?
Correct.
Was there an electropherogram that was provided with respect to this underlying sample?
Yes, it can be found in our validation data binder.
Okay. Showing the defense what's been marked as S-155. Can I hand a copy of the report? Please note, I'm showing you what's marked as 155, S-155. What is that?
So this is the DNA profile electropherogram that comes out of that GeneMapper IDX software.
Okay. And how do we know that this electropherogram is related to this particular sample that you put in your letter on page 1?
So it would be more or less the sample name, which is in the header, kind of above the first red boxes that say mix 10_5_2_1. It's very small print.
And just so I'm clear, the estimated amount of contribution of contributor number 4 here, so the most minor, what is that reflected as in the deconvolution report?
So in this particular amplification, it was targeted at 100 picograms.
Okay. But the percentage of contribution, what was that for the most minor?
Was targeted at 5%, but StarMix estimates it at 3%.
Okay. There are certain alleles on this electropherogram that are highlighted. Who highlighted those?
I did.
Okay, and what was the purpose of highlighting those?
So we know the genetic profile of contributor 4, so I was demonstrating that even at a 3% mixture in this particular profile, that donor's profile is highly represented throughout the profile.
Take that back.
Ms. Wallace, is this the last question on this area? Because I'd like to expand the record on what we just did at sidebar.
I can make it the last question, Judge.
Okay. I'm going to ask for you to step down. You're going to have to be back here for your sake, sorry. But tomorrow at 9 o'clock, we're going to start right at 9 o'clock. So if you don't mind, I would appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
Between now and tomorrow morning, you're not allowed to, other than logistical maybe issues, you can't talk to the prosecutor's office about anything that's going on here today. You're under oath. Don't talk to anybody else about what's going on with this. You'll just be back tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, okay?
Okay.
All right, thank you. There was an objection that was placed on the record that I want to flesh out in a little bit more detail so that the record is abundantly clear as to where we are. So, the documents that were just, I'm asking you, Ms. Wallace, the documents that this witness is referring to the 50,000 pages and the items that were turned over. When were they turned over in discovery?
The underlying data was turned over.
Sorry, excuse me, I have these in my hand.
May I grab those?
Judge, I can
Yeah.
tell you that there were two separate disclosures, because initially what we received from Bodie were two separate PDF documents that were not searchable. They were around, I believe, 50,000 pages. We then requested that they send us the data in a usable format, and on June 20th, that's when we received the actual file system that was used for the internal validation study that actually had all of the individual deconvolution reports separated and organized like they are in the internal validation study. It's my position that the initial two PDF documents were unusable, and it's, you know, I'm not going to suggest that it was intentional, but it sure doesn't seem unintentional.
So that means that you're saying it's intentional, which I
Not
have concern. I want you to be careful with using those types of words. And all I asked was a specific question. I wanted to know when the discovery was turned over. You're saying that it was turned over, and the original documents that were turned over, you were not able to read until they sent it in a different format. Prosecutor, I don't care, Ms. Wallace, Mr. Decker, I don't care, or one of you. I just want to make sure that the record is abundantly clear as to this. Obviously, this letter comes out on April 26th of 2024. I'm trying to find out, number one, what precipitated this letter, and number two, what is the discovery that we're talking about, and when was it turned over, so that it's clear as to how much time the defense had it, and what they did or didn't do with it is up to them.
Understood, Judge. I think we received, Bodie put everything, all the data underlying their validation. They put it on an FTP site, gave us the username, password on May 22nd, 2024. I believe I shared it that day. I'd have to double check. Maybe the next day. I think when I didn't know what was in that site, to be honest, until we gave it to them. I'm sure they looked at it before we did. I know at some point they didn't like the format, and I don't mean Mr. Code, I assume it's his experts, didn't like the format that it was in, and then asked for certain things. Like every time in this case, we then went to our experts, or we went to StarMix or ESR, and we said, this is what they asked for, tell us yes or no, and whatever. So they wound up giving some additional data, and I'll take Mr. Godin's word for it as to whatever that date was.
So here's the thing, Mr. Decker. I'm not here to take anyone's word. I'm here to know whatever the truth is. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Tonight, I want you to take a look at it. I want the record to be abundantly clear as to when these items were turned over. Mr. Godin just made an allegation against the prosecutor's office that sit down, Mr. Godin.
Not the prosecutor's office, Your Honor.
Well, it doesn't matter to me. It's the way that you just said it on the record. We're going to make sure it's clear, because if there is an issue, whether it's StarMix or somebody else, I'm going to get to the bottom of it during this hearing. Mr. Decker, so I'm going to ask between you and Ms. Wallace, I want to know when these items were turned over. I want to know the formats of how they were originally turned over, how it was changed, what the significance was as far as you knew it. And we're going to flesh this out tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock before we continue on with the testimony of this particular witness. So, Mr. Caneiro, you're going to be brought back downstairs, and we'll start back up tomorrow morning. Please make sure that you're ready to go, because we're going to start right at 9 o'clock. So everyone, please be prepared to be ready to start right at 9 o'clock. I'll address any other issues at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.